I had been searching for a new place for weeks, and nothing seemed right. Everything was either ridiculously expensive or in such bad condition that I wouldn't feel safe sleeping there. Then I found this listing. A 2-bedroom house, recently renovated, with a small backyard and a price that seemed too good to be true. The photos showed bright, airy rooms with freshly painted walls and polished hardwood floors. It looked almost staged, like something out of a home decor magazine. I hesitated for a moment. Why was it so cheap? But I convinced myself that maybe the owners just wanted to sell quickly. I sent an inquiry, and within an hour, I got a reply. The agent, a man named Daniel, was oddly eager. He said he could show me the house the very next day. Something about his quick response and enthusiasm felt strange, but I brushed it off. When I arrived at the address, my first thought was that I had made a mistake. The house in front of me looked nothing like the photos. The paint on the siding was peeling, and the front yard was overgrown, weeds pushing through cracks in the walkway. The windows, which had looked so clean and inviting in the pictures, were grimy, almost like they hadn't been washed in years. The whole place had an abandoned feel, like no one had lived there in a long time. Still, I told myself that maybe the photos had been edited or taken a long time ago. I had already driven all the way there, so I figured I might as well take a look inside. As I reached for the doorknob, the air suddenly felt colder, enough to make me shiver despite the mild weather. Before I could think too much about it, the door swung open, and there stood Daniel, beaming like he had just won the lottery. Daniel's enthusiasm was unsettling. He grinned as if we were old friends and gestured for me to come inside without even introducing himself. As soon as I stepped in, I felt it again, that unnatural cold. It wasn't just chilly, it was the kind of cold that felt wrong, like stepping into a basement that had been sealed off for years. The air smelled stale, with a faint, musty odor that reminded me of old wood and something else I couldn't quite place. I glanced around, expecting to see signs of recent renovations, but the place looked worn. The floors creaked beneath my feet, and the walls, supposedly freshly painted, had strange, uneven patches of discoloration. Something about them made my stomach tighten, but Daniel didn't acknowledge any of it. "Isn't it beautiful?" he said, his voice almost too eager. "It's a steal, really. You won't find anything like this in your price range." I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe the house just felt different because it had been sitting empty for a while. Still, I couldn't ignore the weird details. The light fixtures seemed dim despite the bulbs being on. The corners of the rooms had strange shadows, darker than they should have been. And there was this smell, something sour, like rotting wood or stagnant water, that grew stronger the deeper we went. "Does the house have plumbing issues?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Daniel waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, nothing that can't be fixed. It's an old house, after all." He didn't elaborate, and something in his tone made me not want to press further. As we moved through the house, I noticed more inconsistencies. The kitchen counters had scratches that looked almost like claw marks, deep and uneven. A few of the doors didn't close properly, as if the frames had been warped. At one point, I stepped into what was supposed to be the second bedroom and felt an instant, almost physical wrongness. The temperature dropped even more, and my skin prickled with goosebumps. On the far wall, behind a peeling layer of wallpaper, I saw what looked like faded markings, symbols of some kind, drawn or carved directly into the wood underneath. Before I could take a closer look, Daniel clapped his hands together loudly. "So, what do you think?" he asked, his tone a little too forced. I hesitated. Every instinct was telling me to walk away, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. "I'd need some time to think about it," I said, keeping my voice neutral. Daniel's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning, wider than before. "I totally understand," he said, but there was something off about the way he said it. Almost like he had expected me to say yes immediately. He led me back toward the front door, moving a little too quickly, as if he didn't want me lingering in the house for too long. As we reached the doorway, I glanced back one last time. The dim light made the house feel even emptier, more hollow. That strange smell still clung to the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there. As soon as I stepped outside, the cold sensation lifted, like I had just crossed some invisible barrier. The sky was still overcast, but the air felt normal again. I took a deep breath, clearing my head, and turned back to Daniel. "I'll let you know soon," I said, but I already knew I wouldn't. There was something about that place that felt wrong on a level I couldn't explain. Daniel just nodded, his expression unreadable, and without another word, he closed the door. As I walked back to my car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The houses nearby, all of them, looked empty. No cars in the driveways, no signs of life. Just silent, darkened windows staring back at me. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Maybe I was being ridiculous. Maybe it was just an old house with a weird vibe and a pushy agent. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. I started the engine, taking one last glance at the house in my rearview mirror. And in that brief moment before I pulled away, I could have sworn I saw something move behind one of the upstairs windows, just the faintest flicker of a shadow. But when I blinked, it was gone. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept replaying the visit in my head, the strange cold, the faded markings on the walls, the way Daniel seemed so eager for me to decide on the spot. And then there was the neighborhood. I hadn't noticed it at first, but when I thought back, it hit me. There hadn't been a single sound. No distant voices, no dogs barking, not even the faint hum of traffic. Just a heavy, unnatural silence. It felt like the whole area had been abandoned, like the houses weren't really houses anymore, just empty shells. I tried to push it out of my mind, telling myself I was overthinking, but I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that upstairs window again, that flicker of movement that might not have been there at all. The next morning, curiosity got the best of me. I decided to do a little research on the property. If it had been sitting empty for a while, there had to be some kind of history behind it. I started with the listing itself, trying to find more details, but oddly enough, it was gone. Just like that, no trace of it anywhere. When I searched the address, I found old sales records, but they were inconsistent, different sale dates with no clear owner listed. Then I stumbled onto something that made my skin crawl. A forum post from a few years back, mentioning the house by address. Someone had written about a strange experience they had while looking to buy it. They described almost exactly what I had felt. How the house seemed colder than it should be, how the air smelled off, how the real estate agent, a different one, not Daniel, had been strangely persistent. And then they said something that made my stomach tighten. Don't go back. Don't let them show it to you twice. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I stared at the screen. The post was old, buried deep in a thread with barely any replies, but the warning felt personal, like it was meant for me. The person who wrote it never explained why you shouldn't see the house twice, just that if you did, something changed. I told myself it was just paranoia. Maybe they had a bad experience, or maybe it was just some internet creep trying to scare people. But the longer I sat there, rereading that single sentence, the more unsettled I felt. Against my better judgment, I decided to drive past the house one last time. Just to see it in the daylight, to prove to myself that it was just an old, neglected property with nothing sinister about it. When I got there, I almost didn't recognize it. The sky was clearer now, and in the daylight, the house looked different. Wrong. The windows were still grimy, the yard still overgrown, but it was something else that made my stomach drop. The front door was slightly open. Just a crack, but enough to send a surge of unease through me. Had Daniel shown the house to someone else? Had he forgotten to lock up? I knew I should just leave, but something in the back of my mind whispered that if I drove away without checking, I'd regret it. So I stepped out of the car, my pulse hammering in my ears, and slowly approached the entrance. The closer I got, the more I noticed a faint sound coming from inside. Not voices, not movement, just a low, almost imperceptible humming, like the vibration of something deep within the walls. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct in me screaming to turn around, but my hand was already on the door. It creaked open with a sound that made my skin crawl, slow, strained, like it hadn't been used in years. The air inside was freezing. Not just cold, but wrong, like stepping into a place that didn't belong to this world. The sour, stagnant smell was worse now, thick and clinging. I swallowed hard and took a cautious step inside. The house looked exactly the same, yet something about it felt off. It was as if the space had shifted slightly, like the walls had moved just enough to make the rooms unfamiliar. I couldn't explain it, but I knew this wasn't the house I had walked through yesterday. I moved carefully, my ears straining for any sign of movement, but the only sound was that eerie, distant humming. It seemed to pulse through the walls, almost like the house itself was breathing. I stepped into the kitchen, and that's when I saw it, the scratches on the counter. They had been there before, but now they were deeper, fresher, like something had been clawing at the surface just last night. My heart pounded. I turned toward the hallway, toward that second bedroom, and my stomach twisted. The door was open now. It had been closed when I left. The faded markings on the wall, the ones I had barely noticed before, were clearer now. Symbols carved deep into the wood, patterns that made my eyes ache just looking at them. And then I smelled it, something metallic, faint but unmistakable. Like blood. I took a shaky step back, my mind racing. I needed to leave. Now. But as I turned toward the front door, a shadow moved at the top of the stairs. My breath caught in my throat. There shouldn't have been anyone upstairs. The house was supposed to be empty. My body locked up as I stared at the darkened landing, my pulse roaring in my ears. And then, the humming stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Heavier. Like the house was holding its breath, waiting. And then in the quiet, I heard it. A soft creak of a floorboard. Someone or something was up there. I bolted. I didn't look back, didn't stop, just sprinted for the door and nearly tripped over myself getting outside. The second I crossed the threshold, the air changed. Warmer. Lighter. Normal. I stumbled to my car, my hands shaking so badly I struggled to get the keys in the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I looked up just once at the house. The front door was closed. The upstairs window, that window was dark. But I felt something staring back. Watching. I slammed my foot on the gas and tore out of there, not daring to look back again. I didn't sleep that night. I kept expecting to hear that low, awful humming in my own walls. I kept thinking about that forum post, about the warning I had ignored. Don't go back. Don't let them show it to you twice. I had gone back, and I had the sinking feeling that whatever had been in that house, now it knew me. I spent the next day trying to convince myself that I had imagined it, that the house was just old, that the noises, the scratches, the symbols, everything had a rational explanation. But deep down, I knew that was bullshit. Something about that place wasn't right. And then Daniel called. I almost didn't pick up, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hey, just checking in," he said, his voice as chipper as ever. "I had a feeling you might want to put in an offer. Great news, it's still available." My grip tightened on the phone. I hadn't told him I had gone back. I hadn't told anyone. And yet, there was something in his tone, something almost expectant, like he knew. "I don't think it's the right place for me," I said carefully. There was a pause. Too long. And then Daniel sighed, like he was disappointed. "That's a shame," he murmured. "You seemed like the perfect fit." I don't know why, but those words made my skin crawl. Before I could respond, he added, "Just so you know, we've had a lot of interest. It might be your last chance." His voice had an edge now, a quiet urgency that made my stomach twist. I told him I had to go and hung up. I didn't want to talk to him again. But Daniel wasn't done with me. Over the next 2 days, I got 3 more calls from him. Then an email. Then another, this time with an attachment, a contract, already filled out with my name. All I had to do was sign. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. No real estate agent acts like that. No normal sale works that way. It was like he wasn't just selling the house. He was trying to make sure I was the one who took it. Like it had to be me. I decided to do more digging. The listing was still gone, but I found something else. An old news article from years ago, buried deep in archived reports. The house had been owned by different people over the years, but one thing was consistent. No one stayed. Tenants broke their leases within months. Owners resold it at a loss. And then, there were the disappearances. At least 3 people who had lived there had vanished. One in the 90s, one in the early 2000s, and the last just a few years ago. No bodies. No explanations. Just gone. And then I found something even worse. A name I recognized. Daniel. Or at least, someone who looked exactly like him. An old real estate photo from over 20 years ago. The same face, the same fake, too wide smile. The name was different, but it was him. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. He had been selling that house for decades. And he hadn't aged a day. I didn't sleep that night. I felt watched. Every shadow in my apartment felt wrong, like it was stretching toward me. I blocked Daniel's number, deleted his emails. But the next morning, a new message appeared in my inbox. "Still thinking about it?" No sender. No reply option. Just those words. I shut my laptop so fast I almost cracked the screen. I wanted to believe that was the end of it. That ignoring him, ignoring the house, would make it all go away. But a week later, I saw the listing again. Same photos, same ridiculous price. A new agent. And I knew someone else would see it. Someone else would go for a viewing. Maybe they wouldn't leave. Maybe that was the point. I don't know what that house is. I don't know what Daniel really is. But I do know this. If you ever see a listing that looks too good to be true, if the agent is too eager, if the house feels too empty, just walk away. And whatever you do, never go back a second time. Because once it knows you, it doesn't forget.